this, we'll get started.
All right, thank you. I guess I'm on here. I'm going to do the rudeness, and you're going to see my back, but I can't, that kind of distance, I can't even see that far. So a few of you, if you didn't get materials, we'll make sure you do. Raise your hand if you haven't gotten the red booklet. Okay. All right. Well, you're definitely on the, we got 1, 2, 3 folks over there. You're definitely on the cutting edge, right? We're talking about human trafficking in the state courts. Let me ask this. We're going to have 4 segments to this. I'm going to do a little bit of the background and why human trafficking is a topic that is of importance to the state courts. I'm going to talk a little bit about the scope and the forms of human trafficking, modern-day human trafficking, and why that's important to the state courts. I'm going to be followed by Marla Moore, who's going to talk about some of their experience in Georgia and the responses that they're developing and trying to put in place. David Slayton from Texas is going to do the same thing about the activities here in Texas. And then finally, Steve Weller is going to talk about the very complicated intersection of human trafficking involving people who aren't U.S. citizens, so immigrant human trafficking. Let me ask a question here. How many of you have had either human trafficking cases in your court? Every state now in the Union has human trafficking statutes. How many of you have actually seen a human trafficking case in any of your courts? Raise your hand. Okay, so where are you from? Okay, so some in Minnesota, other states? Yeah. Other states that have had human trafficking cases? Yeah. In Texas? Okay, yeah. All right, the reality is that, and then how many of you suspect that you've seen human trafficking victims? They weren't identified as human trafficking cases, but how many of you suspect you've ever seen human trafficking victims in your courts? All right. And I'm going to submit that every single one of you have seen human trafficking victims in your courts, but they haven't been identified as being human trafficking victims. So we'll talk a little bit about the distinction between cases that are brought as human trafficking cases and then the complexities of how human trafficking manifests itself in our state courts. I want to walk you quickly, though, through the material. So take your notebook. You have all the slides, all right? And we feel so antiquated given, we don't have any of the cool stuff like the guy earlier where it flashes off and on and it's kind of fun. Ours is really boring. So anyway, we gave you a copy of the boring things. The second item you have is a kind of a classic comics introduction to human trafficking in the state courts. This recently appeared in the 2013 version of Court Trends that was recently published by the National Center for State Courts. Okay? You have a framework then after that is designed to help you think a little bit about the sources of human trafficking, what's required to really begin to address it, and some of the goals and things that we're trying to achieve when we deal with the topic of human trafficking. Then finally, you have a detailed description in that first pocket of the Human Trafficking in the State Courts Collaborative. And I'll talk about it in a little bit more detail. And it's a collection of organizations, judicial support organizations that have been put together to address this topic in the state court arena. And that's sponsored, by the way, by the State Justice Institute, which is pretty much the sponsor of my life. At this point, I have a little tattoo that says SJI with the logo on it. Now, on the other side, you have a bench card that Steve's going to be talking about on immigration rights and human trafficking and victims. There's some special protections. You've got a human trafficking for Georgia fact sheet, which Marla will be alluding to. And then finally, you have a detailed set of exercises that are designed to use the framework I showed you earlier, but to help you systematically think about human trafficking in your court. Okay, let's start out. Steve, you've got the flipper there? All right, let's see if we can get it to work. You pushed every button and nothing's happened. Okay, go to the next one. All right, so why do we even care about this topic in the state courts? Let me give you a scope, a little sense of what we're talking about in terms of the number of human trafficking victims. Worldwide, it's estimated that anywhere between 10 and 30 million, that's with an N, 10 or 30 million people are currently victims of human trafficking. All right? In the United States, so that's worldwide. In the United States, those numbers are, the estimates range from a low of 300,000 or 400,000 to probably 2 or 3 million. All right? And those numbers, obviously, it's difficult to get realistic numbers about how many victims there are. But let's talk about the forms of human trafficking here. When we talk about human trafficking, we're talking about 4 basic categories that we need to keep in mind. The first is, and the most commonly identified by folks, is sex trafficking. All right? When you think of human trafficking, immediately in the popular media, what do people think of? Well, they primarily think of sex trafficking. And there's a variety of different forms of sex trafficking, and we'll get into that in a minute when we get more definitional. All right? A second form, though, general category of human trafficking is labor trafficking. Okay? And which is more common, do you think? Sex or labor trafficking? What's more common in the United States and worldwide? Sex? Okay, it's labor trafficking. But again, the estimates they vary widely, but it's generally accepted that probably there's more labor trafficking than sex trafficking. And we're going to go into some detail about the forms of that here in a second. All right, then the other thing when we think about human trafficking that immediately comes to people's mind is U.S. nationals, so people born and U.S. citizens versus foreign people. All right, so what's more common? U.S. citizens being trafficked or foreign nationals being trafficked here in the United States? Huh? Okay, so U.S. citizens, it's more likely that when you come across trafficking victims, it's going to be a U.S. citizen. And if we actually were able to come in contact with every trafficking victim, it's more likely that they're going to be U.S. citizens than they're going to be a foreign national. And we'll go into the numbers in a little bit more detail. Okay, so keep in mind when we're talking about human trafficking that we're trying to deal with a very diverse population of folks and that there's a variety of different types of trafficking. Okay, a second thing that I want to point out is that why this is one of the reasons it's a challenging issue for the state courts currently is we're behind the curve. Every state in the union, attorney generals associations, prosecutors associations have been involved in very aggressive anti-trafficking training. It's been a priority of the current federal administration. Most of your states, it's a priority. Every single one of your states now has anti-human trafficking legislation. There's been a lot of education and so forth. It's the priority topic of the current president of the American Bar Association. All right? The social work, the 3 primary social work associations, it's one of their priority topics. On and on and on. All right, so what has happened is that now there's a great level of awareness among many of your justice partners about human trafficking, and we're kind of behind in the courts. Okay, have any of you been asked to be involved in any kind of anti-trafficking groups or these kinds of things? Have you heard about these in your jurisdictions? Okay, we're trying to be ahead of the curve here. I guarantee that you will be. Okay? So there's lots of activity right now around human trafficking. As I mentioned earlier, there's a great deal of attention directed at state laws. And then finally, the most important thing that we're going to go through here is that when we think of human trafficking, one of the real difficulties is recognizing that we may have trafficking victims that are going to appear in a variety of docket settings. They're not going to be in just one part of your court, but potentially in many. And again, I'm going to get into these. All right, let's talk about what we mean by human trafficking. All this is in your materials in greater detail, but let's talk a bit some basic definitional. This is a real mouthful, but let's try and get through it. Go back. Go back to 4. All right. This is the federal definition, but it's a good one. Okay, human trafficking occurs when an individual, and you can read the first part. So an organization or an individual induces somebody, recruits, or harbors or transports, so you can see it's pretty broad, obtains some other person by force, underlined by fraud, because a lot of human trafficking occurs initially by fraud, or coercion. Okay, so fraud, force, or coercion for the purposes of involuntary servitude, peonage, right? We're back to some really interesting things. Debt bondage, or slavery, or a commercial sex act. All right, let's look a little bit more about what we mean by some of these things. A commercial sex act, I think we all have a pretty good handle on that, right? Give me some examples of commercial sex acts that we typically see in our trial court settings. Okay, yeah, so massage parlors, there are legitimate massage parlors, right? And but oftentimes massage parlors are vehicles for what? For prostitution. Okay? And so that's part of the element. The other element would be, so if that's a commercial sex purpose, and often the folks who are coerced are induced into working in what they think is a massage parlor, and then they're involved in other kinds of things. Okay. Give me some others that we run into when you're in your kind of context, in the sex arena. Where's the vast bulk of the more immediate, apparent sex trafficking? Where does it occur? And who are the victims? Okay, so a good place is on the web. Craigslist and so forth and so on. The use of ways to essentially link buyers with the sellers of those services. So on the web, Craigslist, Backpage, and so forth. Where else? Where's some other places? Well, maybe the most common is just prostitution on the streets, or prostitution in a variety of other forms. It's estimated that there's approximately 300,000 juvenile prostituted trafficking victims in the United States today. Approximately 300,000. So the place where people, and then there's even more adults who are being coerced into prostitution. All right, so the thing where most folks begin to become aware of human trafficking in the state courts is in the prostitution arena when it comes to sex trafficking. But there's all these other forms, escort services, underground brothels. One that's really pretty nefarious here is pornography production. We want to make a distinction here. There's quote, legitimate pornography production. From you in California, the valley on the other side of the mountains there from LA, that's one of the main hubs. Well, that's the legitimate production of pornography as opposed to coercing, inducing, forcing people into pornography. You see where there's a difference there? And that's an important distinction to make, and it's one of the ones that makes the enforcement activity increasingly difficult as those lines over time become blurred between what is forced and coerced and what's voluntary and so forth. All right, I think you're getting a feel for it. Cyber pornography, dance clubs of various forms, on and on and on. Let's go into some of the labor pieces here. Involuntary servitude. What's an example of involuntary servitude? What kinds of cases do you think you eventually might see? Yeah? Okay, domestic servants and child care, right? And again, often folks are, hey, you're going to be the nanny. We're taking you from rural Montana, and you're going to be a nanny in New York City, and that's what you're going to do is be the nanny, and that's what you're going to do 24/7. We're going to one way or another coerce or make it clear that you're essentially our servant for a long period of time, if not forever. All right. Peonage and slavery. Slavery, I think we understand, just the outright enslavement of people, no compensation, and so forth. Let's talk a little bit about my favorite, debt bondage, and this is by far one of the most common forms of human trafficking. And this is very common among immigrant populations, one of the more common forms where you are brought into the United States and then you owe a fee for being brought into the United States, and you'll never be able to pay off that fee. All right? So I bring you across a border. You're now a domestic servant in the Washington, D.C. area, working at the Saudi embassy, for example, which happened just recently. And in fact, you owe me for that, for bringing you over here, and you're never going to be able to pay off that debt. Debt bondage is probably the most common form of labor human trafficking. All right, so you got some sense of the scope of what we're talking about here? Pretty wide definitions. Okay. So, go to the next slide there, Steve. Why is this all important for the state court? Actually, go to the one after that. These seem to be out of order. Next one. You're going the wrong way, yeah. No, now you're going the wrong way. We should have gone with the cute stuff like the graphics earlier. Okay. Somehow these are out of order. Human trafficking challenges. Back to 5. Here, give me this thing. 5. Back. 1. Okay. All right. All right. So let me just again, we're on the edge here. Why this is such a tough topic for us at this point in time. One thing, and I'll talk about this in a little more detail, is that state prosecutors, even though they're now aware of human trafficking laws, they're reluctant to use them for a variety of different reasons, which I'll go in. Maybe most of the studies have shown that even though every state now has human trafficking laws, they're very infrequently used, and probably the primary reason is because prosecutors are reluctant to use them, and I'll go into that in a second. Texas, for example, you're from Texas. Texas, what do we have? 26 cases, 26 to 30 cases that were brought as human trafficking cases under their recent statutes in the last year or so. And do you suspect there's more than 26 cases of human trafficking in the state of Texas, with 20-something million? Yeah. All right, and we'll talk about why that is such a problem. A second area is this whole thing of trying to determine how human trafficking may actually manifest itself in the state courts. I'm going to go into that in a little bit of detail. A third big problem area is linking trafficking victims with appropriate resources. All right, many of the resources that we've developed and used for victims generally have been, we find out that they may not be as appropriate for human trafficking victims. There may be some other things going on that we need to take into account. And then finally, a fourth big challenge at this point is how do we use federal protections? There are federal protections that are available for immigrants who are trafficking victims. And these are protections which would allow you essentially to link people with federal resources regardless of their immigration status. And that's key, right? Being able to link people to Medicaid and Medicare-related resources, even though they're not U.S. citizens, and as most of you know, that's pretty unusual, where there are some federal protections to do that. So right now, our first blush is these are some of the most immediate challenges for the state courts. Let me talk through these a little bit. Do the same thing you did. You know what? This thing, part of the problem is, if you go one direction, okay, it automatically goes the other. All right, local prosecutors, often they want to use things that they're more familiar with. That makes sense, doesn't it? And one of the reasons they like to do that is it's much more difficult to prove a human trafficking case than it might be to prove involuntary, some form of kidnapping or something like that. Well, why is it so difficult to often to prove a human trafficking case? Any guesses? What is it about trafficking victims? Yeah. Okay. Even more so than a lot of victims, human trafficking victims are very reluctant to be involved because of the elements of coercion, force, and trickery, right, that have been involved in making you a victim to begin with. Okay, so there's that. There's a psychological aspect, this whole notion of repeated victimization over a long period of time starts to have consequences on the victim in ways where, again, they're not going to be very cooperative. And another part of that is repeated trauma of being victimized over long periods of times. It often makes trafficking victims not their own best advocates, let's put it that way, right? Like many people in court, they're not always their own best advocates, and that is especially the case of trafficking victims. People can be very unpleasant. All right, so prosecutors will do lots of things to try and not use human trafficking statutes, but rather prosecute under other laws. So what's the problem with that? Well, one of the problems is that as a consequence of prosecuting people under other crimes where human trafficking victims and trafficking is involved, is that you end up with the Texas situation where you have 26 or 7 or 30 reported cases per year. And in fact, prosecutors know that it's many thousands, but it's not going to show up in the stats because of the way we structure our information systems and everything else. So just pure trying to get a sense of the scope of the problem is an issue when prosecution is done this way. But what else is the problem? You've now labeled people as criminals, right, who may be partly criminals, but partly victims. Okay? And so it's very difficult then to begin to figure out how to deal with these classifications. Some states have now gone to, in prostitution arena in particular, where they've now defined cases involving human trafficking as something other than a criminal case, but defined it in such a way that you're going to be able to link people with services. How many of you in your jurisdictions, if you don't have a criminal case or a child dependency case or a child abuse case, can you hook anybody up with services? Is that difficult in some of your jurisdictions? Almost all of yours. So trying to figure out ways that you change your linkage to services is a big part of this. Well, if you can't identify people as victims, then you're not going to be able to do that either and link people with services. A couple other things here we got to move on. Let's see. Let's just... Steve, you'll do that in the next part. Okay. I just want to quickly go through how prostitution cases are probably the most common form of human trafficking that we see in the state courts today that we're able to identify. Now, what is it about trafficking and prostitution that's makes it so difficult? One, there's a variety of different forms, and there's a variety of different groups involved in the trafficking of people for prostitution purposes. Gangs now have become exceedingly involved in human trafficking in the sex arena, and particularly prostitution. And this is the case in Texas in particular, but in California and a variety of other places. Why is that? Why have gangs so gotten in the prostitution business? Why do you think? It's a good source of income. It's a steady source of income. And the distribution networks, if you will, and the markets for prostitution help support, they get synergy for other products that gangs are involved in. And what are some of those other key products? Yeah, guns, drugs. Drugs are probably the most common. So now you get this combination of prostitution, drugs, gangs pushing that. And you start to see where the market mechanisms start to be such that it becomes fairly lucrative. All right, what does that mean for trafficking victims? Well, they may be involved in prostitution, but what else might they be involved in where they're going to appear in your courts? What other areas? Drug sales. Drug use, very common, but drug sales. Okay? What are some other areas? What are some other coercive areas? Peddling rings. You ever heard of peddling rings? Those kids on when you're in Los Angeles or wherever, where you're on the street corner selling flowers. It's not like Girl Scout cookies or something like that. That's another form. But that's not coerced, even by my daughter and some of your children or whatever. But peddling rings are one that's a fairly common form of human trafficking, where people selling flowers or this, that, and the other thing. That's often much more organized, selling candy, so forth. And that's an area where human trafficking is often manifested. Theft and other offenses. Organized theft, organized shoplifting rings often involve human trafficking victims, especially juveniles, where groups of people will hit a store in organized fashion. A couple others. Health code and other ordinance violations are an area of human trafficking that we're starting to see more and more of. And how does this work? All right. Do you know that a lot of health code inspectors now, they're trained to spot signs of human trafficking, especially in large urban jurisdictions. So if I'm a health code inspector and I'm going into your restaurant, what might I be looking at in addition to whether the toilets are clean and the food's being stored at a proper temperature? What am I going to look for? Huh? Beds, yeah, okay. So you often, what's behind that door? Oh, there's nothing behind that door, and they open it up and there's a barracks, basically, with a locked door and no way to get out, and there's often, that's a good sign that there may be human trafficking. So health code and inspection services, people are often ones that identify. Restaurants in particular, and then agricultural inspection and elsewhere. Some places, yes. Jack's question was, have those people been trained? Some local health places are now starting to train. I'm not sure in Los Angeles, but in a number of states they are starting to become aware of this. The federal government has very much become aware of this, partly through the Department of Homeland Security is working with TSA, right? When you go TSA, every TSA person is now in the process of having them training in human trafficking. Every airline attendant will have training, everyone involved in the FAA. Throughout the entire federal government, there's a great emphasis on training people, and that includes agriculture, food inspection, and so forth and so on. So again, there's a great effort to increase awareness, which will be trickling down into the state court setting, partly because it's one of the few things that the federal government will still pay for. It's one of their priority areas. Okay. Juvenile delinquency. I don't think we need to go into great detail here, but there's often a potential for great human trafficking presence in the juvenile delinquency arena. And this is one that we always get in trouble when we say it to some groups, but the facilities and the services that we've developed for foster care and for juveniles and detention and protection services for juveniles are often used as recruitment areas for human traffickers. All right? So when young girls or young boys go to group homes, traffickers aren't dumb. They figure out ways to recruit people out of those. Now, one of the other things I want to emphasize here is that human trafficking is one of the great equal employment opportunity crimes. Okay? That it's not just a guy thing. And this is one of the things that's a little hard to take. It's not just the insidious, evil, stranger thing. A lot of trafficking occurs by family members, either parents or relatives or aunts and uncles or cousins, siblings, sisters, each other and so forth. And women, it's one of the areas where women are actively involved in all stages of the processes. And part of that is due to long-term trauma and victimization. Part of it is because it's just lucrative and so forth. But it is one of those where it's easy to stereotype based on Liam Neeson movies or something like that, but it's a much more complicated picture. Child abuse and neglect cases, as interviewers in the social service arena become more sophisticated about their assessment tools and their ability to interview and find out, they become more human trafficking aware. They start to identify increasing numbers of victims. And again, all these groups have, this last year, really started to work with their organizations nationally and get that down to all the membership by attending conferences like this. They're going through these topics in detail. Okay. I'm going to skip this next one, but identifying a juvenile trafficking victim, we got to move on here. I think I've hit most of this. Key points here: prostitution for juvenile girls in particular. Again, it's very, when's it voluntary? What does voluntary really mean? When's it coerced? And it doesn't matter. Any person 18 or under who's involved in commercial sex is by definition a trafficking victim. Okay, you got that? In every single state, I believe now, but certainly under federal legislation, there is no commercial sex transaction involving a juvenile that is not considered coerced. All right? So by all definitions, human trafficking, prostitution involving children is going to be considered human trafficking. All right? And we talked about the coercing people into other activities as they're engaged in prostitution. You can go through the rest of these. One of the most vulnerable populations in the trafficking arena is runaway children. They have been identified as probably the highest probability group of U.S. nationals to be involved in human trafficking. So runaway children. I'm sure you see this all the time. When any city you go to, you see kids out on the street, and it's like just an invitation. They're going to, for recruitment or whatever. Okay, let me do one last thing here. Unfortunately, we don't have time. This is one of my favorites. Traffickers now, they're one step ahead of our responses to combat trafficking, and now they've figured out that one of the ways to ensure stability of their product, people, is to get guardianship over their product. All right, so we've seen in jurisdictions where they're very concerned because people come in for guardianship, and it turns out that they want the folks to, they want that guardianship so they can continue to traffic the people. They want legal guardianship so they're in a position to do that easier. So anyway, there's a variety of different ways that people keep moving ahead on this. All right, I want to just mention some of the resources, and again, these are all examined in detail in the article. This is a tough list. If you just look through this list, how many of you have all this available? How many of you have all this available for anybody? Not too many of you, right? Okay, but let's take a look at some of the key things that a variety of organization groups have identified as being important. Safe housing, key, safe housing. You know, removing people from the situation and putting them in safe housing. Oftentimes when we remove people from the situation, we think we're putting them in safe housing using our usual collection of foster care homes or whatever, and it turns out we're not. We're putting them in places where it's easier to recruit. And you can just go down the list. I want to just do a couple others. One of the keys is new Social Security numbers, new Social Security cards. This is an interesting one, right? That traffickers take all the documentation and then they can pretty much use that documentation, because they've got the person's identity basically, to try and track their whereabouts. So one of the things is just being able to get new documentation. It's not easy to get new documentation, is it, in most of your states, much less get a new Social Security card. So this is actually one of those that's a real challenge. Okay, I want to just finish here and let the panel get going. I've talked way too much, but the final piece of document I want to refer to is this whole description of the Human Trafficking in the State Courts Collaborative. This was funded by the State Justice Institute, Jonathan Mattiello, the directors here. And basically, we've got a collection of organizations. You can look and see who's involved, and we're adding new partners all the time. But our whole purpose is really to try and identify how human trafficking is going to manifest itself in the state courts and what we can do about it. Okay? And a lot of elements are included in that initiative, but one element that I want to emphasize is we're going to have a website up pretty quick, a Human Trafficking in the State Courts website. And we'll send all the people the links to that. We've got an opportunity to do intensive technical assistance where we come into jurisdictions and try and help figure out what trafficking might look like in your jurisdiction. And then also we're developing a variety of materials and trainings and so forth that you can use all over the country. Okay, so if all this is kind of makes your head spin, this is just the beginning, right? As a profession, we're just now trying to figure out what this is all about. Marla and David now are going to tell you a little bit about what it's like to be a pioneer as you wander through this area, and some of the lessons learned thus far as 2 states, Texas and Georgia, that have embarked down trying to address this. Okay? Thanks.
Good morning. Everybody out there? Yeah. I have worked in the state of Georgia for a number of years, working on issues with gender bias, racial and ethnic bias, looking at interpreters and how we're providing language access in our courts. But it wasn't until I became director, became director of the Administrative Office of the Courts, it was about the time that we were getting information about the burgeoning immigration population in Georgia. And particularly we had a county that had the highest percentage growth in the country. And coming in as a new director, how is that going to be impacting our courts? Well, it just happened that I was at a conference, and John walked up to me and said, well, we're working on an SJI project, and we'd really like to include Georgia in this. And I have been so thankful that we had that meeting and that we have been able to have this partnership. We began the partnership in September of 2011, and it was called the Immigration and State Courts Initiative. And that project focused mainly on judicial training and records work, but human trafficking sort of burbled up in those discussions, and particularly when we were in Gwinnett County, which is a metro county, metro Atlanta urban county, and has a high refugee and immigrant population. We have the court administrator from that circuit, Phil Bodwins, is back here. So I'm sure he is very much aware of some of what's going on there. But as we were doing that work, not only Gwinnett County, but other places around the state, we discovered that this was an issue that was that our courts were facing, both sex and labor trafficking. Surprisingly, what has not come up much in the context so far, I believe, is the crimes associated with drug use and drug sales, although, of course, we're not finished with our work. But because of what we found in the outreach to our courts and our recognition that there was other work going on in our state in this area, we have been able to extend our work with the Center for Public Policy Studies to be a part of the Human Trafficking in State Courts Collaborative, which John was just talking about. I want to give you some information about Georgia, just sort of some background landscape information, and you'll find most of what I'm going to allude to here in the handout material. But I wanted to point out a few things here. One, you may not know, but Georgia is geographically the largest state east of the Mississippi. We also have about 10 million population in the state, which ranks us, I believe, at 8th in the country for population. We have 4 major interstates that go through the state. We have 2 ports with distribution coming into the state. And we have an international airport, which is the busiest in the world on many days. Of our population at 10 million, about 910,000 were foreign-born. Between 1983 and 2008, we had about 56,000 refugees brought to Georgia. 13% of the homes in Georgia have a language other than English spoken daily. 5,000 girls in Georgia are at risk of being sex trafficked. Approximately 374 girls are commercially sexually exploited each month in Georgia, with the average age into the sex market being 12 to 14 years old. Each month, 12,400 men in Georgia pay for sex with young women, and 7,200 of them end up exploiting an adolescent female. As John said earlier, Craigslist is the most efficient medium for the marketing of sex, and about 65% of that happens in and around the Atlanta airport. And Atlanta has the distinction of having the highest number of trafficked Hispanic females in the nation. On average, 100 juvenile girls are exploited in Georgia each night. Now, those are some pretty sobering statistics. And Georgia's my adopted state. I love it. I've been there 32 years, and I want us to do better. But I also want us to look at, we need to acknowledge the broad response to human trafficking that has been occurring at the state level in all 3 branches of government. The judiciary is a little behind, as was told before. It's the same in Georgia. But in 2012, the General Assembly created a joint human trafficking study to evaluate models of victim services in other states and compare them to what's going on in Georgia. And they were to recommend a framework for a comprehensive system of state services for all victims of human trafficking. The study came up with 3 major recommendations. They wanted to mandate the posting of a model notice for the National Human Trafficking Resource Center hotline in certain establishments. Things that I think you would suspect: bars, truck stops, adult entertainment establishments, farm labor contractors, hotels, emergency rooms. The second was they wanted to provide for the modification or the vacation of orders of delinquency for children who are victims of sexual abuse or trafficking, and provide for the sealing of court records for children who are victims of sexual abuse or sexual trafficking. And then thirdly, they wanted passage of the Comprehensive Juvenile Code rewrite, which had really been in the works for a number of years, but they were particularly interested in its provisions related to status offenders. Those are the runaways and truancy cases, which historically in Georgia were classified as delinquency and that has shown a relationship to trafficking. Well, I'm happy to say that in the 2013 session of the General Assembly, all 3 of these recommendations passed. We expect further legislation in the upcoming session, as there were bills left hanging, and we have a two-term session in Georgia, so you start the term in 1 year and finish in the next. So those bills that did not pass that first session are still pending and can be dealt with in the next session. But they deal with notification of federal assistance that is available, looking at crimes and offenses of children who have been sexually exploited, and then also funding for the Safe Harbor for Sexually Exploited Children Fund. In the judicial branch, we have defined our work on this issue through our participation in the Human Trafficking in State Courts Collaborative. The project's official kickoff was held on April 17th, during which time we brought together service providers, policy and advocacy program leaders, executive branch agency personnel, and legal services providers to define the scope of trafficking issues related to Georgia courts. These partners also helped us identify other stakeholders that should be brought to the table. It was a little problematic that only one judge was able to attend this first meeting, and that judge only for a short period of time. But the second and third meetings were then devoted to judges and prosecutors. And that meeting happened in June. Those meetings happened in June. The issues raised were far-reaching, and they follow along with some of what John has told you, and I'm going to summarize them a little bit here. One thing that was at the forefront was education and raising awareness. It was high on everyone's list for every group, every stakeholder, every segment. The service providers, raised a number of issues regarding human trafficking in the court and what they were seeing. They wanted acknowledgement that the victim may be trying to protect the trafficker for various reasons. They depend on that trafficker in many ways, that they're coerced, and it's something we should expect. They want to see juries receive education on the dynamics of trafficking. And some of you have been in this work, with other things. You hear some of the same kind of themes that we've dealt with domestic violence issues, for instance. We need to be aware that the trafficker may convince the victim that the courts won't protect the victim. Child victims may need to testify without the trafficker present. And that's an issue, of course, we know. You have a right to face your accuser. A prosecution can take up to 3 years, and with both the victim and the trafficker out in the community, the justice system needs to be able to provide for separation and protection of the victim from the trafficker during that time. They feel that the judge may need additional time to assess possible trafficking problems. But key to these service providers is that the judge realize that the judge is the leader of the justice system, knows the culture and the justice system in their communities, and should be able to be a leader in solving these problems. Trafficking issues can appear at all levels of courts. Georgia is a non-unified system. We have 5 different trial courts in every county. Additionally, we have municipal courts. And then, of course, we have our appellate courts. That's a challenge. And then the issue of limited English proficiency, which occurs in many of the cases that we're seeing. And another issue is with the Department of Children and Family Services. They're required to report, but only when it is a family that is a family member that is involved with the trafficking. If they have a child who has been trafficked by someone other than a family member, then they don't have the ability to send those children to specific services or to report what's going on. But when we met with the judges and prosecutors, they were very cooperative and really worked to help define what their issues are. And their concerns also fell into 3 major categories. First, and again, some of this is going to follow along with what John has told you, we found in Georgia, was the difficulty in prosecuting human traffickers. And there was a sort of a faction of prosecutors who perceive that the statutes are too broad and too vague, so they can't really obtain a conviction. But then there's another group that say, well, yeah, maybe it's too broad, but we can use these by combining them with some of our more conventional charges, and that gives us an opportunity to open up and admit additional evidence. When organized crime is involved, there may be a partnership with the federal prosecutors, another opportunity. They also noted that if it is only a labor trafficking case without sex trafficking, the human trafficking statutes may be the only option for prosecution, because guess what? The enterprise isn't breaking any other laws. So unless we can go in there on human trafficking, there's nothing we can do. And finally, trafficking victims, as we know, may hurt the prosecution by being uncooperative out of fear of their trafficker. To me, that sounds very much like the problem we've dealt with in domestic violence for many years. A second line of discussion from the judges and prosecutors was around identifying and handling trafficking victims. Here it is seen that there's a need for law enforcement to be trained, for them to properly identify a victim as opposed to a co-conspirator. Judges and prosecutors in misdemeanor cases need training to identify and handle cases where a person charged with an adult crime is a prior victim of human trafficking, particularly with regard to when to dismiss prostitution charges. I have been struck in some of the programs that I've been in recently where, in particular, an example is a police officer who was talking about this, very passionate about the human trafficking, but could not stop calling the victim a prostitute. And the whole presentation, changing our culture on these things is something we really need to be thinking about. But as John alluded to, if we don't have proper identification of these cases that leads to prosecution of victims, it makes it very difficult for us to obtain accurate data on the number of human trafficking victims and the kind of services that we need to provide for them. I think a major issue, the third issue that came up, was really in our juvenile justice issues. In a juvenile case, in Georgia, you will have an adjudication in a county where the crime was committed, but the disposition is determined in the county where the juvenile lives. Without cross-jurisdictional coordination, which we don't have routinely, human trafficking victims will not be identified and provided appropriate services. We did in this past session enact a new Child in Services statute. It's a CHIN statute that takes effect on January 1, 2014. And it provides that runaways and other status offenders cannot be held in detention. These are the juveniles that are highly vulnerable to victimization by traffickers. They often end up homeless and turn into serial runaways. They're the most vulnerable. Unfortunately, prosecuting the juvenile for a criminal charge such as prostitution may be the only way to get such a juvenile into the custody of the court. But this can lead to undesired collateral consequences, especially for immigrants. And we know that juvenile detention has been identified as a prime location for a child to be lured into a traffic situation. However, some judges would like to see legislation that will allow them the authority to put a victim into a residential facility. It is a sad case that the only way we can help a victim is to take them into custody. And again, I hear echoes of what we have dealt with in domestic violence, where we wanted to sentence the victim to counseling or some other service. And it is a sad fact that our juvenile trafficking victims can be difficult to handle, as they may be unruly and uncooperative. They are poor candidates for foster care many times, and they may make unsympathetic witnesses. And we know that our prosecutors, our law enforcement, are very unwilling to go forward with a case if they don't have a willing victim. Judges are also concerned about the ethical issue of acting as an advocate for a human trafficking victim in the context of a criminal prosecution without compromising their neutrality, and this concern may limit their ability to assist the victim. Overarching these issues are the barriers caused by limited resources and services for these victims. Services for minors, especially girls, are more easily available than are services for adults or boys. Additionally, there is information lacking on the network of resources available in Georgia. So not only are the services limited, but those that are available are not as widely known for some judges and prosecutors. For adult human trafficking victims, the victim advocates attached to the district attorney's offices routinely handle T and U visas and other victim services, and I think Steve is going to cover some of that when he talks to you later. Well, what do we hope to see come out of the project? The participants in our hearings have agreed on the following as their desired outcomes. They want increased awareness and understanding of human trafficking across the justice system. They want to develop protocols on how to identify trafficking victims. They want to develop best practices for judges on how to handle trafficking victims in court, including determining the appropriate roles for the judge and providing for the safety of the victims. And they want to identify and develop services for trafficking victims. We plan to bring together the entire group along with additional stakeholders that have been determined, have been identified in this process, that should be brought to the table to ensure that we have addressed labor and sex trafficking within all regions of the state. And we are also investigating, and hopefully we'll be able to hold a summit in Georgia next summer on access issues facing the judiciary, which will include this topic. I want to thank today, I have some very good staff back in Georgia who have been working on this project and helped me with my remarks, as well as John and Steve and the good work that they have done. And particularly, we could not be doing this without the help of SJI, and I want to thank Jonathan for that help. Okay. I'll turn it over to David.
Thanks, Marla. I just want to take this opportunity to, one of the nice things about being the NACM president-elect is that you get to plan the conferences and you get to select the educational material. So this session has a special place in my heart because it's you get a bully pulpit sometimes to put out education what you want. And last May, as we began planning this conference, I ran across human trafficking by accident, to be honest. I have been in the courts for 15 years, working at a trial court, the federal court level, and then at the state court level. And I'm ashamed to say that I had never really heard of human trafficking and even knew that it existed. And I was at an event where it wasn't even a court-related event, and someone came and started telling the stories about what human trafficking was all about. And I started seeing how this was occurring, and so my immediate response was, well, that is a really bad thing that those other countries are doing. And I can't believe that could happen all across the world. And then I quickly realized that they weren't talking about other countries, they were talking about our own country here. And, we're at the 50-year anniversary of the Civil Rights Act. We're at the 50-year anniversary of the Equal Pay Act. A lot of things that happened 50 years ago, but yet we're still struggling with some of the same issues. This one just in a little bit different form. And I think it's something that we in the court community need to get really passionate about. I know Marla and I were talking beforehand about how we could try to control our emotions in this, because it is something that I think that we in the court community are a little bit behind in, and that we need to step up and begin to take ownership and figure out what role we play in addressing this serious issue. About a year ago, Texas, I began and contacted John and got involved in a project for Texas looking at human trafficking. And let me just give you some statistics really fast. First of all, the city of Houston in Texas, according to the U.S. Department of Justice, is one of the largest hubs for human trafficking. There are over 200 active brothels in Houston, with two new brothels opening each month. Houston is home to more strip clubs and illicit spas than Las Vegas, and many times, of course, these operations serve as fronts for human trafficking. It's said that many of the individuals who are victims of human trafficking oftentimes begin their trip in Houston. Obviously, in addition to the sex trafficking issues there, the large border that Texas has with Mexico contributes to a large migrant labor force. We also have highways that run all across the state. And of course, the diverse population of Houston allows victims of human trafficking to be easily disguised amongst the population. So it's a huge issue that we face just in Houston, but if you look at our human traffic statistics, a recent report by the Texas Human Trafficking Task Force reported on some data that they even report in their report as elusive. We have a system in Texas called the Human Trafficking Reporting System, which is an online portal where Department of Justice funded task forces and voluntary participants of other law enforcement agencies can enter data on suspected human trafficking incidents. So obviously that's just mostly voluntary and very narrow. 11 Texas-based reporting agencies submit to that. And between 2007 and 2012, there were 678 human trafficking-related incidences and 167 suspects arrested from those offenses. Of those that were arrested, so we're talking 678 incidents, 167 arrested, 79 were ultimately convicted. 13 inmates are currently serving sentences for human-related trafficking offenses in Texas, and 52 inmates are serving sentences for compelling prostitution. One of the really interesting things as we began to look at this project is I began to look at what had been done in Texas. And interestingly enough, Texas has been somewhat of a leader nationwide in addressing human trafficking. Our first laws that were put on the book to begin to address this were passed in 2003. There are now specific statutes that provide for criminal prosecution of those offenses. However, as John alluded to earlier, it is rarely being used. And part of that is for the reasons that John has laid out. Prosecution oftentimes uses other offenses to try to convict the perpetrators, and that's just an issue we looked at. One of the things that we began to look at as far as how we can address the situation, a part of the issue for us is that the way that offenses are charged. For years, the trafficking offenses have not been the most serious offense, and of course the way that we track the data, it's basically based upon the most serious offense. And so we're looking at how offenses are charged and how we deal with that information. And the legislature just recently, in the most recent session, actually increased the penalty for human trafficking offenses to some of the actual offenses are now second-degree felonies, and so that should be something we'll be watching. Part of the other issue is the reliability of court data that's being submitted on this. Obviously, data is not everything because each one of these cases is a victim, but it's helpful to have data to know what the extent of the problem is. And as John reported, we had very few cases reported, and actually only 5 counties in Texas reported having any human trafficking related cases in the last year. Part of the issue is that we believe that many of the victims are being prosecuted for their crime, and many times those are not being shown as obviously victims of human trafficking. An additional issue that we are trying to address through the project and working with the collaborative human trafficking project is on awareness in the judicial system. As I told you, Texas has been leading the way since 2003 in this area, except if you read any of the research, any of the reports that have been done, it all focuses on law enforcement, prosecution, and corrections. Of course, as we know, there's an hourglass narrowing right in the middle, which are the courts, and there's been very little done to try to engage the courts in this issue until recently. And so one of the things we're working on is how do we ensure that prosecutors, defense attorneys, court staff, judges, probation officers, whoever is involved in the criminal justice system in the middle, or the civil justice system, or the family law, whatever, juvenile, whatever you look at, that those individuals have the proper training to be able to spot victims of human trafficking when those cases arise. They may slip through the cracks. Some law enforcement officer may not use the training they may have been provided to recognize the victim. So what kinds of things can judges, court staff, probation officers, those type of individuals, what can they do to help spot these individuals and bring that to the attention of the court? The other thing, and this has been raised already, so I don't want to spend a lot of time here, but part of the issue is even once these individuals are spotted and identified, there are very, very, very few services available for them. So one of the things that our project is looking at is how do we expand the quality and availability of services to the victims of human trafficking. Obviously, this is an issue we face in many areas. You think about mental health services, drug treatment services. There's always seems to be this limited availability. But when it comes to human trafficking services, some of those are related, mental health and drug treatment. But these cases are very different because of their extreme victimization in many cases. And so we're looking for individuals to do that. The additional issue with services are that obviously Texas is very large, and many of our communities are rural and lack any services. Yet many times these are where the labor victims may be because of the agricultural communities that are being used in these areas. In addition, we have very limited non-English speaking services. So for victims who don't speak English, those services aren't there. And oftentimes, many with the immigrant population, we have a need for that as well. So those are a few things we're working on there. In addition, we have a couple of prostitution courts in the state, and we're looking at how those courts can be well trained and have the access to the services that they need to be able to refer victims of those cases of human trafficking to that. Obviously, as Marla said very clearly up here, part of the issue is trying to ensure that the culture looks at prostitutes differently than they used to. I know John challenged me in one of our first meetings. I think most of us are, maybe this is not most of you, but in my past, I oftentimes looked at prostitutes and thought, well, why don't you just quit doing that? And as the more I learn about it, the more I learn that, and John actually challenged me with a statistic that I forget what the percentage, some very, very high percentage of prostitutes are doing that voluntarily. Most of them are being coerced in some form or fashion. Now, they may be continuing to do it because that's all they know and they've got other issues involved, but most of them do not enter it as a voluntary basis. And so trying to look at the cultural issues of how we view prostitutes and how judges look at them is obviously a huge issue that we're working on as well. The other thing too, and I'm going to let Steve talk about this extensively, but making sure that when there is a victim of human trafficking that they have and are referred to the services available to them under the immigration benefits. So obviously he'll talk about what the federal government has done for trafficking victims and how we deal with that. And then just looking at those different things. So I think, no one said it in here, but I think the thing that we need to begin to look at is that human trafficking sounds like such a really, it's not all that of an offensive word. And I've begun to think more and more that maybe we need to change our language on this to really say what this is for what it is, which is a modern-day slavery, and that I think more citizens react differently to that. More of our court staff and judges would react differently to that. Human trafficking, what does that mean? Someone's driving down the road with some people in the back of a truck? No, that's not what that means. But in fact, it is. We're facing an epidemic of modern-day slavery that I think we need to address. So we're very early in our stages with working with the project, and we don't really know where this will go. We expect that we'll have significant educational efforts with our judiciary, our court staff, clerk staff. I think even we need to realize frontline staff can sometimes see this. It's not just people in the courtroom. It could be someone coming to the counter with some person behind them and how do we recognize that and how do we make sure they arrest it? So I recognize it. So we're talking about education, and we're also talking about tools for judges to have on the bench books, bench guides. You see the one in your handout today, but trying to tailor those specifically for Texas so that our judges know exactly what options they have when these cases arise. So we're really excited about this. I hope all of you will walk away from here. I don't know how many of you walked in this room knowing a lot about human trafficking. I hope some of you knew a lot more than I did when I started looking at this a year ago. But I hope you'll walk away from here at least asking the hard questions when you get home about what are you doing in your jurisdiction to address this issue. What resources do you need to take back to your judges and your court staff and probation officers or juvenile justice system, whatever it may be, to be able to help them to deal with this issue, which is becoming a larger and larger issue for us that I hope we can get a grasp on before it gets worse. So I'll turn it over to Steve and let him tell you a little bit about the immigration issues.
Thanks. Is this on? It is. I'm going to flip through these slides for a second and see if I can actually succeed in getting where I want to be. Okay. Everything you've heard about all the problems with trafficking victims is even worse for victims who are non-U.S. citizens. At the same time, there are protections that are available for non-U.S. citizens that don't exist for citizens, and that's what I want to talk about. Let me, first of all, call your attention to this bench card, which is specifically aimed at the immigration rights of human trafficking victims. So we're going to be producing a lot of other bench cards in this project that will have much broader significance for all trafficking victims, but this one is aimed specifically at a series of protections that are included in federal immigration law. And I want to raise one other beginning point before we get into these in detail, and that is to go back to John's definition of trafficking. If you remember the definition of trafficking, and I won't go back to the slide, but it included recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining. Notice that transportation is just one word in that definition. Trafficking victims, the word trafficking does not mean that you actually have to drive them someplace or transport them someplace. They may be here already, and that includes immigrants. So there's not the necessity of putting them in a car and moving them from one place to another. They are people who are being forced to do things because of coercion, fraud, or whatever, and they may already be there and they just fall into it because of that. So particularly with immigrants, keep in mind that they don't have to be brought over. The act of bringing them over here does not have to be a trafficking act. They may be brought over here for employment, or they think they're coming over for employment. There may be a variety of ways that they get here legally, and then they discover that what they're here for is not what they thought they were going to be here for. Oh, I guess I haven't gone far. Oops, I'm going back. Why am I going backwards? I'm hitting the same button over and over again. Okay. I want to talk about four main protections with regard to trafficking victims. And some of these apply to much more broadly than just for trafficking victims, but they are possible protections that a trafficking victim can get. And those are U visas, T visas, VAWA, which is Violence Against Women's Act protections for immigrants, and Special Immigrant Juvenile Status, which is aimed at juveniles who are unable to be reunited with their parents and unable to be returned to their home countries. I hope this still goes in the same direction. Okay, U visas. A U visa, it's called a non-immigrant visa. We can't do an entire lesson on immigration law here, but basically, a non-immigrant is a person who is here for a temporary purpose. Typical non-immigrants are people who are here on student visas, travel visas, whatever. The U visa is also considered a non-immigrant visa, which means that it has a limited length of time to it. And as you can see in the second bullet, it lasts for, after 3 years, it's possible to adjust it to a real ability to stay here forever, which is what a lawful permanent resident is. But in the meantime, it's classified as non-immigrant. And it's a non-citizen who has suffered severe physical or mental abuse because of criminal activity, is or is likely to be of use in prosecution of the perpetrator. And it requires a certification from a federal, state, or local judge, prosecutor, law enforcement officer, or other justice system official. So it doesn't have to just come from the prosecutor. The certification can come from a judge. It can come from anybody involved with the justice system that has knowledge of how this person is likely to be of help to the prosecution of a case. Now, the word criminal activity, I didn't define on this slide, but you have it in your bench card. There is a list of criminal activities that count for U visas. It's a limited list. Obviously, very serious crimes that are in that list. It's got to be one of those crimes in order for the person to become eligible for the U visa. An important thing, and we'll get to this in more detail, is the notion of being able to adjust status to lawful permanent resident. In order to be able to adjust status, this requires an application. The U visa also requires an application to U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. There are two types of visas, actually three types of visas that we're going to be talking about, where the application actually does not go locally to your local field office, but it ends up going to the Vermont Service Center. So they're all determined in Vermont. The certification has to go along with it. The adjustment to lawful permanent resident status is something that is done locally. So after the person gets the U visa and has been here for 3 years, they can adjust to that status. A number of wide variety of crimes can prevent you from having the ability to adjust to lawful permanent resident status. And we'll talk a little bit about those, because some of those can be involved in trafficking, and it's an anomaly of federal immigration law and what goes on with trafficking victims in general, that trafficking victims that come into the courts as criminals in criminal cases, not as victims but as perpetrators like prostitutes, that conviction may then in turn make them ineligible for certain kinds of immigration benefits. So being able to identify a trafficking victim, which is critical for all of the work we're talking about, including all the services that Georgia and Texas are trying to put together, and I'm sure many of your states are as well. So for citizen victims, it's very important. For immigrant victims, it's also important because convictions can prohibit them from obtaining the benefits that we're going to be talking about. So U visas are one important visa that can be available. Trafficking is one of the crimes in that list of criminal activities that I told you about. This is the visa that's most specifically aimed at immigrant trafficking victims. It's the T visa. The T does not stand for trafficking. It stands for 1101A15T, which is where it just fell into the statute. Just like 1101A15U is where the U visa fell. So it just happens to be a T. It's available for immigrant victims who have meet the following requirements. The first one is the victim is of a form of severe trafficking. Now, what is severe trafficking? Under federal immigration law, any trafficking of a person under 18 for sex, that is any kind of commercial sex trafficking for an individual under 18, is a form of severe trafficking, by definition. So any juvenile is eligible for a T visa on that basis, as long as they meet the other requirements. But that can be an issue for some of your courts where The juvenile court has jurisdiction up to age 18, but at the age of 17, an individual who commits a crime may be considered under state law to be an adult. So some of the kids who may be actually eligible for T visas and are victims of severe form of trafficking because they're under 18 may end up being prosecuted in an adult court because in your state they're considered an adult if they're 17, which I believe Georgia is one of those. Yes. So it's something to keep in mind, realizing that some of these juveniles may actually not be prosecuted in juvenile court. And that'll come back in another way when we get to special immigrant juvenile status as well. The maximum length of stay, and if the person is 18 or older, the person is complying with a request to assist in the prosecution of the traffickers. That is not required of somebody who is under 18. The maximum length of stay is 4 years and it can be extended. Again, the holder of the T visa is eligible to apply for lawful permanent resident status after 3 years, so it is a pathway to get to become lawful. And a lawful permanent resident status for a non-citizen is a required step toward becoming a citizen. You have to be a lawful permanent resident first, and then you have to meet the additional residency requirements once you become a lawful permanent resident to achieve citizenship. The T visa also requires something called good moral character, which is also something that is required for naturalization. We'll also see it's also required for VAWA cases. Good moral character, again, is one of those, first of all, in federal immigration law, it is totally undefined as to what it is. It is defined as to what it isn't, so there's a list of things that negate good moral character, but there's no definition of what it actually is. But there are a variety of types of criminal activity, and prostitution happens to be on that list, that make a person not of good moral character. So now you have the anomaly of somebody who is applying for a T visa on the basis of being a victim of commercial sex trade, but if they're prosecuted and convicted of prostitution, that may eliminate good moral character and therefore really eliminate their ability to achieve the T visa that's exactly aimed at what they're doing. So all the more important that these people be identified as trafficking victims and there are ways that can be found to not then convict them of being a prostitute, but rather convict them of being, in some places for juveniles, they're calling it commercially sexually exploited children and C-sex, and they're treated separately and they do not have a prosecution conviction on their record. Violence against women. I did it right this time. The Violence Against Women's Act initially was put in, at least the immigration consequences were put in, to handle cases where an individual brings a spouse into the country. The individual is here lawfully. The spouse is brought in, and if the marriage took place within 2 years of when the spouse is applying for status, both the husband and the wife must apply for status to convert what they brought in as conditional lawful permanent residents rather than as regular lawful permanent residents. And there were a number of cases where the spouse bringing it in, I use husband because it more often happened that way, would use the fact of that conditional status as a means of abusing the spouse. They would say, well, if you don't do what I want you to do, I'm going to send you home in 2 years. I'm not going to sign the papers. The VAWA gives that person, they're called self-petitioners. It gives that abused spouse the right to petition without the husband. It also applies for children. An abused child can apply for status under the Violence Against Women's Act as well. As I said, you must show good moral character. The abuser in those cases must be either a U.S. citizen or a lawful permanent resident in order to be able to use the Violence Against Women's Act. So these are going to be family-type cases. And as John mentioned, there are family-type cases can be sources for human trafficking. Parents have actually trafficked their children. So if a person is being, and trafficking is one of the crimes that can give rise to the right to avow a petition if you're a trafficking victim. So this probably is not the most important of the benefits that are available under federal immigration law, but it is a possibility if nothing else fits.
Got 5 minutes.
Okay, I'm getting there. Special immigrant juvenile status is an important one because a lot of these kids are going to end up in the juvenile system. An immigrant who is first of all under 21 and who has been declared dependent on a juvenile court by a juvenile court, and I'm going to tell you what a juvenile court is in a minute. And you can see the rest of it is placed under the custody of an agency or department of the state, his reunification with one or both parents is not viable due to abuse, neglect, or abandonment. Or the law says a similar basis found under state law, so if you don't have the words, if it's something else that means abuse, neglect, or abandonment, that counts. And for whom it has been determined that it would not be in the individuals, and I use the word alien because that's the word in the statute, best interest to return to the juvenile's previous country of nationality or last habitual residence. These are the findings that have to come out of a court for special immigrant juvenile status. And there has to be something behind them. You can't just have a form that states these things. There has to be reasons, as to why you believe that, the evidence that they are dependent, the evidence that they can't be reunited, the evidence that they can't be returned to their home country. And that evidence has to come from someone other than a judge. A judge is obviously not going to make a phone call to a foreign country to say, is it possible that this person could be persecuted if that person is returned? So that you're going to depend on prosecutors, child protective service workers, whatever. What is a juvenile court? A juvenile court is any court with juvenile jurisdiction, according to the law. So dependency is the most obvious one, dependency courts. Delinquency courts are also possible, a place where SIJ status may begin. And a lot of these kids actually do end up in delinquency courts, a lot of trafficking victims, because they're there either as John mentioned, runaways, other kinds of status, or I guess it was Marla mentioned, other kinds of status offenses. And these kids are, a lot of the trafficking victims are runaways, and they're difficult for the courts to deal with because they run away on a serial basis. Or they might be there because of prostitution. Or they might be there because of drug sales associated with being a trafficking victim. The trafficker may have them, may be selling them for sex 5 days a week and having them sell drugs on the 6th day. If they're put in juvenile detention and they, at that point, start recruiting other kids, what do they become? They become traffickers. So now it's a possibility that they could be prosecuted for being a trafficker, not a trafficking victim. All of those things may happen in the context of a delinquency court, a delinquency proceeding. John also mentioned that they might come up in a guardianship proceeding, and that may take place in, say, in a probate court, where the trafficker is applying for guardianship. That also, any court that can take custody over a child and place a child somewhere is a possible juvenile court for this purpose. It's particularly important to remember that the convictions can then come back to haunt this juvenile in terms of the ability of that juvenile to be eligible for adjustment of status. What the special immigrant juvenile status gives you is, first of all, it allows you to stay in the country, and most of these kids are here unlawfully. It makes you eligible to work. and eligible to receive a variety of services that you wouldn't be able to receive otherwise. And it makes you eligible to apply for adjustment of status to lawful permanent resident, which either happens typically concurrently, or it may be there may be a delay if the kid is in juvenile detention, in ICE detention as well. As I had mentioned earlier, the grounds of inadmissibility still apply for adjustment of status, so the types of crimes that a juvenile might be found guilty of. Now, criminal convictions in juvenile court do not count as adult convictions, but certain behaviors, including engaging in prostitution, do not require a conviction in order to prohibit you from becoming a lawful permanent resident. So admitting to those in a juvenile court proceeding can be an issue for a juvenile. I think we've already talked about some of the issues with regard to trafficking immigrant juveniles. There's no secure housing available. We also said that if they engage in other illegal activities, it might affect their ability to achieve the status that is supposedly available for them. That's why, as we've said over and over again, I guess it is really important to try to identify trafficking victims before they're convicted of something, and try to deal with them outside of the notion of a criminal conviction.
Okay, we're over time. We want to thank you. We can take a couple quick questions if there are any. I know this is a lot of material. The bottom line on the immigration piece is there are potential protections in federal immigration law to help you work with trafficking victims. It's one of the rare areas of federal immigration law where they kind of thought through that they'd like to put some protections in there. And obviously it's very complicated. There's a lot of details, but it's something that we found judges in particular find very useful to learn about these things, because they often feel so helpless. What am I supposed to do? I've got victims here, and they're probably here illegally. There's no hope. What am I supposed to do? This is something that we found very useful to be able to. Obviously, we spend days just talking about this topic, but it gives you some opportunities to link people with resources despite their immigration status. All right, this is a lot of stuff. I know it's kind of head-spinning. Again, this is the beginning of a conversation, not the end, right? This is a topic we're all struggling with. We've got a ways to go on it. The collaborative, we had our initial organizational meeting last week with all the partners. We're really excited about where we're going to be able to go. And contact us, because we do have the opportunity to shape resources and to be able to be helpful for you in any way that we can. Okay, so any other questions? I know it's lunchtime. Anything people want, you can come up and ask us as well. All right, we want to just thank you for hanging in there, and we'll see you later.